Anyone who's seen my previous videos knows how highly I regard the games made by Squaresoft for the original PlayStation. Final Fantasy VII was the game that got me into RPGs, and it remains my favorite video game of all time, and 8 and 9 were no slouches either. Those three alone would have been enough to cement PS1-era Square as the greatest RPG developer of that generation, but in the space of only 3 years we were also graced with Xenogears, Chrono Cross, Vagrant Story, Saga Frontier, Final Fantasy Tactics, Parasite Eve, Legend of Mana, and those are just the obvious ones. But as great as those games are, if I'm being honest, sometimes they can be hard to replay. I'll be blunt, most of them are dark, disturbing, and deal with incredibly heavy subject matter. Hell, for the longest time I had this idea that Final Fantasy IX was the lighthearted one of those 3 Final Fantasy releases, but in reality, that game features multiple genocides throughout its 40-hour runtime. And sometimes, I just don't want to go through something that heavy.
And lucky for me, though most of Square's games of this period were far from cheery,
they did release one game that was able to scratch that itch. Brave Fencer Musashi is a game that I've loved since I was 8 years old. Released in 1998, right between Final Fantasy VII and VIII, it's a spirited action RPG that values surprisingly robust combat and comedic storytelling above all else. It's also a game that, for a large contingent of RPG fans, remains forgotten, unjustly forgotten. I think everyone watching this would really enjoy it if they gave it a shot, so I hope this video convinces you that it's worth playing. So, I mentioned in the previous paragraph that Brave Fencer Musashi is an action RPG. This may not seem like a big deal if you're looking at things from a modern perspective. After all, with the success of Kingdom Hearts and modern Final Fantasy, Square is arguably a more prolific developer of action RPGs than traditional RPGs at this point. But you have to understand, from the perspective of someone in 1998, this was a monumental break with tradition. Throughout the 90s, Square developed only 3 action RPGs, the 3 games in the Mana series, and we in the West hadn't seen a release of a Mana game since Secret of Mana came out in 1993. Fans of the action RPG genre were better served by Square's main rival Enix, who were busy publishing classics from developers like Quintet and Tri-Ace. So what caused Square to pivot into this unfamiliar territory? When the game began development, in February of 1997, Final Fantasy VII had been out for less than a month, but even in that short time, everyone knew what a game changer it was. It was, after all, the fastest-selling video game in history at the time of its release. 3D RPGs were the future, and Square was eager to adapt. In an interview with IGN, director Yoichi Yoshimoto admitted that his team were all big fans of action RPGs, and saw the advent of 3D gameplay as a golden opportunity to push the genre forward. And so that's what they did, crafting an original story based on the wanderings of the legendary Edo-era samurai Musashi Miyamoto and his rival Kojiro Sasaki. Although don't worry, the game does its own thing and it's not like you need to be well versed in Japanese history to understand it. Musashi released in Japan in July of 1998, just a year and a half after it began development, with a North American release on Halloween of that year. The story is set in the All-You-Can-Eat Kingdom, who is currently being invaded by the evil Thirst Quencher Empire. In response, Princess Filet of All You Can Eat summons Brave Fencer Musashi, the legendary hero who sealed away the Wizard of Darkness more than a century ago. Expecting the embodiment of honor and chivalry, the retainers of the kingdom are shocked when the Musashi who appears before them turns out to be a young boy who's honestly kind of an asshole. But he's the real Musashi, and if the kingdom is to be saved, then they must work together to rid the world of Thirst Quencher's evil. Musashi sets out to reclaim his legendary sword Lumina, which he gets in like the first 10 minutes of the game, but in his absence, Thirst Quencher kidnaps not only the princess, but 35 other retainers of All You Can Eat Kingdom, sealing them in magical diamond cages called Bincho Fields. So Musashi must now rescue the princess and the other citizens of All You Can Eat, while at the same time doing all he can to put an end to Thirst Quencher's tyranny. Alright, so let's start by addressing the elephant in the room. All You Can Eat Kingdom, Thirst Quencher Empire. Did Square pull a 4Kids Entertainment for the English localization of this game? Actually, they didn't. These weird food-based puns were all present in the Japanese version, albeit slightly modified. The citizens of All You Can Eat were originally named after Korean barbecue dishes, and the translation staff, probably correctly assuming those names would go over the heads of most Western players, switched them over to more general barbecue names. The Thirst Quencher Empire got the most drastic changes. In Japanese, their name is the Reikoaru Empire, which is an anagram of the Japanese pronunciation of alcohol, and as expected, their subjects are all named after alcoholic beverages. However, because keeping those names in the American release would have stuck them with a higher rating from the ESRB, all references to alcohol were changed to reference soda instead. This inadvertently led to some ridiculous moments in the English translation, such as this building that's obviously supposed to be a bar referred to as a restaurant, and most ridiculous of all, this character who's obviously supposed to be drunk being rewritten as having had too much soda. Very early 90s Nintendo of America censorship here, but hey, I can understand why they did it. Outside of those changes, the names kind of give away the tone the game is going for. Obviously, this is not a deep or complex story. The core narrative of a mythical hero being regenerated to save the princess and the kingdom as a whole is about as basic fantasy storytelling as you can get. But telling a deep and complex story isn't Square's aim here. The feel of Brave Fencer Musashi's story is a lot different from most other RPGs. It reminds me instead of the TV show that, more than anything else, defined my childhood. Every season of the Power Rangers can more or less be structurally summarized by the following. Some ancient evil is unleashed, establishes a base somewhere, and spends every episode attempting to take over the world and defeat the heroes in what comes across as the most ridiculous ways possible. I mean, in the first season, we have Rita Repulsa summoning an accordion-playing gnome to hypnotize a group of school children, and in the next episode, the very next episode, she sends down a giant anthropomorphic pig to both eat the entire world's supply of food, but also ruin the hero's food fare for good measure because she's evil like that. This is basically what playing Brave Fencer Musashi is like, and it's kind of a fever dream. To give just a few of its plot beats, a giant mechanical knight terrorizes the kingdom, a steam reactor goes on the fritz, an army of vampire zombies takes over the village when the sun goes down, the village's water supply is dried up, the village is set on fire. All of this just happens one after the other without warning. I have to give the writers credit, I genuinely had no idea what was going to happen next for the majority of the game, and that made me want to keep going just to see what other insane scenario was coming next. Something else that aids this tone is the fact that the staff are clearly not taking anything seriously, with every character portrayed in such a way that it's obvious Square's tongue was firmly in their cheek during the writing process. I mean, this is a game that opens with the following exchange.
Who did you say was puny? And why are you guys wearing such stupid costumes?
Stupid costumes? Take that back, you little turd!
Please, princess, Sir Little Turd, calmeth down.
Admittedly, that's the high water mark for the game's ridiculous dialogue, but that's more or less what you can expect throughout the entire thing. And since I played that clip, I should probably mention the game's English dub, and believe it or not, it's another anime's joint. Those who watched my video on Xenosaga Episode 1 have already heard me sing their praises over and over again, but for the benefit of those who haven't, Animes was an anime and video game dubbing studio that I believe to be the most talented to ever work in the American industry. The legendary Cowboy Bebop dub, that was Animes. I don't need to say more than that. Now, obviously, Brave Fencer Musashi's dub doesn't hit those emotional heights that Cowboy Bebop's does, but to be fair, I wasn't expecting it to. Animes clearly understood what kind of game they were working with, and it sounds like the crew were having a blast bringing these characters to life. Mona Marshall's portrayal of Musashi perfectly nails the brattiness of his character, and the always wonderful Steve Bloom is great as the mysterious treasure hunter John. And again, you have to remember, this game came out in 1998, a time when most video game voice acting sounded more like this.
I know what you want. You want the stone.
Compared to the vast majority of its contemporaries, Brave Fencer Musashi's dub is in another universe, and even today I still think it ages pretty well. Alright, so that's enough of the story. The game doesn't put too much stock in its storytelling, so I'm not going to in this video. Its presentation and gameplay are where the lion's share of the attention went, so that's what I'm going to focus on. So, in 1998, the entire video game industry was still trying to get the hang of 3D game development, and Square was not an exception to this. If you take a look at the games they released around that time, you can tell that every one of their directors seemed to have a competing philosophy for how 3D should be handled. Final Fantasy VII chose to utilize 3D characters against pre-rendered backgrounds. Xenogears took almost the polar opposite approach, with sprite-based characters set against an interactive 3D world. Brave Fencer Musashi is arguably the most progressive of the lot, opting for full 3D environments and characters at a time when virtually none of their other games were doing so. And I have to say, I think the look of the game has aged remarkably well. Yes, it's a late 90s Square game, so the polygon count is low enough to count on two hands. I've laughed at the jokes just like the rest of you. But this kind of low polygon 3D graphical style has such a charming atmosphere that I can't help but get a smile on my face whenever I see it. Part of that is admittedly nostalgia, I'm sure, but just look at how bright and cheery everything looks. It's a lot closer to something like Mega Man Legends than anything in the Final Fantasy series, and I love Mega Man Legends, so that should be taken as a compliment. I wish more developers would make games that look like this. I'm hoping that just as we've seen more high-profile games with 2D pixel art in recent years, this kind of low polygon 3D style will make a similar comeback. It's something that shouldn't be relegated to an artifact of the mid to late 90s. Now I want to talk about the music, which is exciting because it gives me the opportunity to give credit to someone who I think has been criminally overlooked. The soundtrack for Brave Fencer Musashi was composed by Tsuyoshi Sekito. Square had recently hired him from Konami, where he worked on the soundtracks for such games as Metal Gear 2 and Tiny Toon Adventures Buster's Hidden Treasure. Musashi was the first soundtrack he composed for his new employer, and his work must have impressed them, seeing as how he later worked with Nobuo Uematsu on the progressive metal Final Fantasy cover band The Black Mages, and is now assisting Yoko Shimomura on her brilliant work with Kingdom Hearts. This guy is no slouch, and anyone who listens to Brave Fencer Musashi's soundtrack will understand that. It's one of the PS1's hidden treasures. Much of it is spirited, infectiously catchy numbers well suited for this sort of adventure. At the same time, Sekito is surprisingly adept at crafting some very relaxing atmospheric tracks as well. The theme to Grillin Village, for instance, has been among my favorite town themes since I first heard it when I was 8 years old. I'm going to put a link to the soundtrack in the video description. I can't recommend it highly enough. Alright, now let's talk about the gameplay. Aside from the tutorial in Chapter 1, you're either going to be relaxing in the hub world of Grillin Village, or traversing through one of the game's dungeons. I want to start with Grillin Village, because this is one facet of the game that really impressed me. It's certainly small by today's standards, but consider, though the game came out in 1998, it has so many features that are way ahead of their time. Not only does it have a full day-night cycle, but it also keeps track of the time and day of the week. Shops will only be open on certain days and times, and each town person has their own unique schedules that they follow. Basically, it's a lot like Shenmue, the only difference being that Brave Fencer Musashi is actually fun to play. The shops run the gamut from a grocery store, where you can buy health recovery items, a bakery, where you can buy items that recover your BP, a pawn shop where you can appraise items you find in dungeons, and even a toy store where you can buy action figures of the game's characters and enemies. These action figures have no practical purpose, they're basically just 3D models that have a couple movements and voice samples, but they're a fun bonus for any player who's into 100%ing their games. So once you head out of the village and into a dungeon, you're going to run into monsters, and since Brave Fencer Musashi is an action RPG, combat plays a major role. So let's talk about that combat system. Combat in Brave Fencer Musashi is built around Musashi's two swords: Fusion, a short sword that hits quick, and Lumina, a larger, more powerful sword that takes a bit longer to swing. You can use each sword individually, or combine strikes into short combos. This system is mostly satisfying, though I admit it's probably going to take a bit of getting used to, and that mostly comes down to Fusion. Simply put, Fusion has incredibly short range, and I get it. Musashi's a short dude, and Fusion's a short sword. It makes sense that he won't be able to hit that far in front of him. But it felt like I was always constantly having trouble gauging how close I needed to be in order to land a hit. Aside from that, I think the combat is solid. It's fast-paced, and there are a ton of different enemies, almost all of whom are unique to their respective dungeons. And then, of course, there are the boss fights, of which there's at least one in each of the game's 6 chapters. While a few, like Musashi's rival Kojiro, are basically there as a joke, the rest are a fair challenge. Generally, each boss has a set attack pattern the player needs to memorize, and memorizing it allows Musashi to exploit its weak spot. They're a combination of fight and puzzle that requires the player to utilize every skill they've mastered up to that point. I do need to bring up one potentially frustrating thing, however. Each boss has a very narrowly defined window where Musashi can deal damage. For some, like the Steam Knight and the Sculpion, this is easy enough to discern. A crystal appears as the weak spot. But for others, the game makes no indication of this whatsoever, which means you could attack an attack without so much as scratching them. I don't know why they didn't make this standard for every boss, but they didn't, so when you fight them, be aware that you can only deal damage at very specific points, regardless of what the game itself seems to tell you. As you progress through the game, Musashi will discover the 5 scrolls, representing the elements of earth, fire, water, wind, and sky. Finding a scroll grants Lumina a new elemental-based ability. The Earth Scroll enables you to cause earthquakes, the Water Scroll envelops you in a giant bubble, allowing you to not only shoot water at your enemies, but run across the water for a short time. The Fire Scroll shoots fire, obviously. The Wind Scroll gives you access to a whirlwind attack, and the Sky Scroll allows you to fly. These new powers give you both additional advantages in battle, as well as new ways to navigate through the world. Looking at the Earth Scroll, for instance, you can use it to destabilize your enemy, but also use it to knock large obstacles out of your way, clearing new paths for you to explore. Fusion has a bonus ability of its own, and it's probably the most unique facet of the entire battle system: Assimilation. Assimilation is where Musashi throws fusion at an enemy and absorbs the enemy's powers. It's kind of like Kirby in a way. Every enemy will have a unique ability for Musashi to assimilate, and these abilities are extremely varied. Some are primarily used as projectile attacks in combat, others cause different status effects to your enemy, while others still are used exclusively to progress through very specific obstacles and dungeons. As an example, this flower that spits bowling balls, which grants Musashi the ability to throw bowling balls of his own to break holes in a number of cracked walls throughout the rest of that dungeon. Some may consider these systems to be overly gimmicky, and there's admittedly some truth to that. You can progress through most of the game using Musashi's base attacks, while using Assimilation and the elemental powers only in those specific instances where it's necessary to progress past a major obstacle. This never really bothered me though. I liked the variety it offered, and in the case of Assimilation, it was a lot of fun just seeing what kind of weird abilities you'd find whenever you find a new enemy on the field. Those abilities aren't free, of course. They cost Bincho points, or BP, to use. Bincho points can be increased by discovering Bincho Fields in dungeons. Breaking a Bincho Field not only grants you an increase of 5 to your BP gauge, but also frees the prisoner trapped within the field. These prisoners, once freed, grant Musashi additional bonuses, and once again, these bonuses are extremely varied. Some are essential to progress in the game, like the 3 carpenters who assist you in finding a piece of the village's broken gondola. Some teach you new combos, some unlock new items to buy at the store, and some just subtly change the background music whenever you're in the castle. The system provides good incentive to explore, and rescuing the prisoners gives you a real sense of progression, like you're rebuilding the kingdom piece by piece. It's sort of similar to the feeling I got when playing Quintet's games, albeit on a much smaller scale. Bincho Fields aren't the only thing you can find in the wild. You'll find items all over the place, and most of them need to be appraised. So you bring them to the pawn shop, and when he's done, you'll have an item that you can actually use. Some of them are just there to be sold for extra money, but others are profoundly important, like the pieces of the legendary armor, which, as the name suggests, is a suit of armor that grants Musashi with even more powers, the most important being the ability to climb certain walls and double jump. And can I just say how impressed I am that Square was able to put so much variety into this game that you can probably beat in like 10 to 15 hours? One could say that they were throwing anything at the wall just to see what would stick, but I think it's impressive that so much of what they threw at the wall actually ended up sticking. Anyway, I'll move on. I mentioned earlier that you can raise your BP by finding Bincho Fields, but what about your other stats? Brave Fencer Musashi's level system is kind of similar to that of Final Fantasy II, where progression is based on what specific actions you do in the field. But don't worry, it's nowhere near as obnoxious as it was in that game. There are 4 stats you can raise: Body, Mind, Fusion, and Lumina. Fusion and Lumina, as you would expect, grow the more you use those specific swords. Body increases your overall strength, and it goes up as you kill more enemies. Mind raises your defense, and it grows the more you walk around the world. I have no issues with any of this. Progression's based on common sense, and there's no stupid Final Fantasy II caliber exploits like how attacking yourself is the quickest way to raise your HP. So that raises the question, how do you in fact raise your HP? There are a few different ways. You get a bonus every time you meet a boss, but you can also get additional bonuses by finding Minku. Minku are little white creatures that only come out at night. If you find one and pick it up, it drops a longevity berry, and those longevity berries raise your HP by 25. They're entirely optional to find, but really, why would you want to pass up the opportunity to get these easy bonuses? Alright, there's one more major facet of Brave Fencer Musashi that we have yet to touch on, because aside from being an action RPG, the game also incorporates platforming elements. Now, if you've seen my video on Xenosaga Episode 1, you know that my opinion on platforming in Square games of the late 90s is, shall we say, less than stellar. Xenogears was annoying, and Threads of Fate was absolutely atrocious. Thankfully, Brave Fencer Musashi's platforming is better than either of those games, but still, I wouldn't call it great. It always felt like I underestimated the distance I needed to complete a jump, and some platforms have very odd, super precise hit detection that inevitably cause me to fall through the floor, even though I technically made the jump. Thankfully, about halfway through the game, you'll receive the ability to double jump, which makes platforming significantly easier and less obnoxious. But even with that safety net, you're still going to have to keep an eye on two factors that can complicate platforming, one of which is cool, the other of which is really annoying. I'll start with the cool one first. Remember earlier when I was talking about how the game not only has a full day-night cycle, but also a time and calendar system? Well, aside from impacting the town's schedule, these systems also impact Musashi's stamina. Stay out and run around for too long, Musashi's going to get tired. Get too tired, you're barely going to be able to move. You can rest up by spending the night at the hotel, in Musashi's private room in the palace, or most memorably, passing out in the middle of a dungeon. Yeah, this game has a mechanic where you can choose to sleep anywhere you want to, anytime you want to. Obviously, you're not going to get the recovery that comes from resting in a real bed, but still, if you're in the middle of a dungeon where there's no bed to be found for miles, sometimes it pays to stop what you're doing and take a nap. So that's the cool one, and here's the annoying one. Poison. Every RPG ever made has some sort of poison state your characters can fall into, and Musashi's no exception. Like other games, poison slowly drains Musashi's HP over time, but in addition, it also severely limits his ability to move, jump, or even swing a sword. It puts you at such a profound disadvantage that it's barely worth trying to make progress if you're poisoned. You can cure it by using an antidote, and some enemies can be assimilated to cure it as well, but if none of those options are available to you, you're kinda screwed, because poison does not go away on its own, no matter how long you wait. I really don't like this. Sure, you can mitigate it pretty easily by always making sure you have an antidote in your inventory, but I don't think that something that has this much of a negative impact on how your character plays should be this potentially long-lasting. So this retrospective has been pretty positive overall. What few complaints I have are admittedly fairly minor. However, I have to end by discussing the one aspect of Brave Fencer Musashi that's pretty damn near impossible to defend: the minigames. There are a couple of minigames that you're forced to play to progress through the story, and almost all of them are awful. First, there's the River Ride. In it, you have to navigate a river on a raft made of 4 logs, and if you so much as touch any obstacle in your way, one of the logs breaks off. Lose 4 and you lose the game. I've seen a lot of people complain about this one online, but honestly, it's probably the least obnoxious of them all. The game provides you with a fairly extensive trail of money that, if followed, will keep you out of harm's way until the end. But be absolutely sure you keep to that path. The hit detection is so sensitive that so much as grazing against anything in your way will inevitably lose you a log. Again, with the game giving you those hints, I don't understand why that one gets so much flack when the minecart minigame is a thing. The minecart essentially plays the same as the river ride. Avoid obstacles in a minecart, and if you get hit 4 times, you lose. But there are 3 major reasons why this is way more obnoxious than it should be. 1, the game seems to go on forever. 2, you aren't given any sort of indication as to where you need to go to stay safe, which condemns you to passing it through tedious trial and error. And 3, you move at such an insane speed that it's virtually impossible to process what's ahead of you in time. The only reliable way to make it through while taking minimal damage is to repeatedly pause the game every other second so you can take stock of any upcoming obstacles, which destroys any immersion the game may have. This is such an amazing failure of game design that it's almost impressive, especially in a game that I've had this much praise for. Anyone who's ever complained about minecart madness in Donkey Kong Country hasn't seen anything until they've played through this.
Donkey Kong Country is truly perfect.
Literally the only positive thing I can say about it is that thankfully, failing it doesn't result in the game over. You can repeat it as many times as necessary until you succeed, which seems to me to be an implicit admission by the developers that the game is impossible to pass without any repeated attempts, but hey, what can you do? And then of course, there's Steamwood. So one of the story beats in Chapter 2 is that Steamwood, the reactor that supplies energy to the kingdom, goes on the fritz and Musashi has to fix it. And oh boy, is fixing it a pain in the ass. Steamwood is basically a giant vertical pillar consisting of narrow walkways, platforms, and 8 numbered valves. Musashi needs to turn those valves in order from 1 to 8. This is done by pressing X a number of times when the steam meter rises to an acceptable level. Compounding all this stress is the fact that you're given 2 separate time limits. You have a base 20 minutes to turn all 8 valves, but once you turn the first valve, a second, much shorter timer appears. You have to turn that next valve before that second timer hits 0. If it does, you'll have to start all over again from valve 1. I really hate this. Some of the later valves have such a small room for error that it's very easy to waste all your time just trying to establish a working rhythm. And this doesn't even take into account the platforming. To reach some of the valves, you need to jump to avoid obstacles, and remember how I said that the platforms in this place are narrow? Yeah, it's super easy to fall here, and if you do, have fun waiting for the elevator, of which there's only one, and it moves at its own schedule. This is by far the most infamous portion of the game, and it's easy to see why. It plays into every one of its weaknesses and absolutely none of its strengths. And what's most indefensible is that the game forces you to repeat it a second time later on at increased difficulty. All I can say to anyone who has yet to play the game is don't let this section turn you off. Ultimately, it's only a tiny fraction of overall playtime. The rest of the game is absolutely worth seeing through to the end. As obnoxious as these minigames are, they're really the most serious complaint I have about this game. In all, my opinion of it remains very positive. Before doing this retrospective, I hadn't played Brave Fencer Musashi in a number of years, so I really wasn't sure how it was going to hold up. And honestly, I'm way more impressed with the game now than I was before. Yeah, the game has some rough edges, and I wouldn't say it handles any of its systems, whether combat, platforming, or what have you, exceptionally well, but that doesn't matter to me. Brave Fencer Musashi is such an exciting ride that its flaws are negligible, and for a game that came out in 1998, it was way far ahead of its contemporaries. So that begs the question, why was this game forgotten, unlike so many of Square's other hits of the late 90s? Again, I think there are a number of factors at play here, and none of them are really the fault of the game itself. The first is that, as I've mentioned in the past, Square's output for the PS1 was heads and shoulders above just about every other video game developer on the planet. Brave Fencer Musashi is a very good game, don't get me wrong, but games like Final Fantasy VII, Xenogears, Vagrant Story, these are more than just very good games. They're all-time classics. We were truly in the midst of an embarrassment of riches. Musashi's only crime was that its star didn't burn as bright as those in its immediate orbit. The second factor is similar to its first. In the West, Brave Fencer Musashi was framed by the gaming press as a potential Legend of Zelda killer, and looking at the gameplay, it's not hard to see why. Unfortunately, this was the worst possible time for anyone to release a Zelda killer. Brave Fencer Musashi released in North America on Halloween of 1998. Not 3 weeks later, Nintendo released Ocarina of Time, and unfair as it may be, no other Zelda-esque game was going to stand a chance competing against what would become perhaps the most critically acclaimed video game ever made. The final factor is a bit more unfortunate. Brave Fencer Musashi has never been re-released in any form since its 1998 debut. This strikes me as very odd, as Square has historically been very good at keeping their older games accessible. You can buy ports of any of the PS1 Final Fantasies for every modern platform under the sun. Hell, in 2022, we got an HD 2D remake of Live Alive, for God's sakes, and that game was never even released outside of Japan. Why this one game in particular has fallen through the cracks seems incomprehensible to me, but it perfectly strikes home the need for increased game accessibility. If a game is not legally available on an easily accessible platform, people are going to forget about it. It's as simple as that. The best that can be done in that circumstance is for people like me to do what little I can to draw attention to the fact that it's out there and it's worth playing, so that's what I'm here to do. If any of this sounds fun to you, by all means check this game out. And please, don't bother paying $100 on eBay for a used copy. There's no reason to do that to yourself. RetroArch is free. This is not a game that's going to change your life, but that's not why you want to play it. You want to play it because it's an endlessly entertaining, feel-good action RPG that's well ahead of its time, and sometimes that's all you want to get out of a video game.